Welcome to What the Duck, a podcast with real experts talking about direct spin challenges and experiences. And now, here's your host, SourceDay's very own manufacturing maven, Sarah Scudder.
Thanks for joining me for What the Duck, another supply chain podcast brought to you by SourceDay. I'm your host, Sarah Scudder, and this is the podcast for people working in the direct materials part of supply chain in manufacturing. I'm at Sarah Scudder on LinkedIn and at S. Scudder on Twitter. I've decided to change things up a bit and incorporate past interviews I've conducted from our LinkedIn Live events because I feel the content is good and relevant to our podcast audience. So today, here's an interview from a LinkedIn Live show I hosted earlier this year. Today, I am going to be joined by John, Stephen, Rachel, and Nathan. They have extensive manufacturing experience, and I've asked them to come on today to share some of their absolute most crazy supply chain train wreck stories that they've lived to. And of course, what are some of the learnings that we can all take from the nightmares that they've lived through? So I'm going to go ahead and start with Stephen in the intros.
Hi, so my name is Stephen Drummy. I am currently a lead buyer at Sanmina Corporation. I mainly work with new product introduction and launches and kind of onboarding. That's majority of my experience, both in electromechanical and electronics as well.
Rachel, quick intro from you, and thank you for being so dedicated and joining us from the car today.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Rachel Hassel, 15 years of experience in the CPG world, working on everything from cosmetics to home care to personal care. Started off in R&D and moved my way into procurement and supply chain. So interesting background there. Fun fact about me. Number one, I'm in my car. Number two is I'm the only person in my family, cats included, that does not have a British passport. So that's me.
Thank you, Rachel. Nathan.
So Nathan Cunningham, I worked at Tesla for 5 years in supply chain. I now run a supply chain analytics consulting agency.
John, you're up next.
All right. My name is John Hansis. I'm the Director of Logistics for AMP Global. About 20 years in the industry, prior background engineering. Did some time at Amazon. I actually did some work with Steven's company now that when he said it, with Philips Lighting Signify. So I did quite a lot of work with them. But basically the easiest way I sum up what I do is if it moves, it comes through me. And most of the time, no one knows what we do until we don't do it.
Stephen, my first question for you is what issues have you run into with customer supplied material?
I guess particularly for me, especially with onboarding for new customers, you're very frequently working with customer supplied material. You're very antsy, and they want to make sure that you've got the parts to start building to meet their schedule. So every company kind of operates a little bit differently. Some companies, especially ones in R&D, might not have a robust process for handling and managing materials. It's not really the focus of their business model. So why would they invest into something like a ERP? Well, maybe not ERP, but MRP system, which means you can occasionally find yourself kind of managing a mystery at times. But specifically, I think I can think of a very recent onboarding project where they didn't really have any list of open orders or specifics on delivery dates or quantities or part numbers, suppliers. So it was kind of very early on in the prototyping development phase. But without any of that information, it kind of makes it difficult to load good information for into your ERP MRP system, so that you're accurately driving your own supply, and then kind of giving you the ability to plan accordingly. So that's definitely a tricky situation to kind of navigate. That's definitely a concern that I would see with having to kind of manage customer supplied material.
So Stephen, did they just drop off a box to you? Like, is that what happened?
Oh, well, it wasn't just the box. It was pallets, 60 something pallets of
with no information.
Very limited amount. There was, and then it kind of kept coming. A lot of the stuff they would order, they'd place orders out in advance with suppliers, and then suppliers were holding some of the material. So we kind of had this trickle in of customer supplied material for quite a while. But yeah, and so kind of the impacts of that too is we had to a lot of the stuff we wanted to count. Obviously, we want to verify everything we're getting, and make sure that we're not, that there isn't a huge mistake or something that we've missed. And then I think also what kind of compounded this already issue was that the customer wanted to waive incoming inspection for a lot of this material because a majority of it came directly from their facilities. And in hindsight, that was definitely that was not a good idea. We probably should not have done that, because that fairly quickly found floods of material coming in or hitting MRBR TV, which was, and it didn't really have anywhere to go other than back to the customer. So, but fast forward kind of over 2 quarters, we found ourselves, kind of running into these significant shortages for various reasons, quantities. No one's perfect with counting, and also with quality issues, or parts mistakenly put getting swapped between each other. But I think the worst offender was a 22-week lead time custom part that was made overseas. And we didn't quite realize, both companies thought the other company had the parts, and in fact neither of us had the parts. So we figured that out at the very, very end of Q3, beginning of Q4, and kind of managed with a lot of hard work, vigilant supplier, to kind of get material enough to build units for Q4, and still to this date is the highest quantity that we shipped in that quarter too.
So Nathan, you used to work at Tesla. Very near and dear to my heart, since I am from the Bay Area, and just about everyone I know has a Tesla now, including my sister who just bought her second Tesla. So Tesla's, I'm going to call it production hell, seems to be the most famous nightmare in recent history. Can you maybe shed some light to us on what the heck is going on? Let's start there.
Yeah, so production hell was a very famous phrase that Elon shared on Twitter, late 2017. So pre-COVID, before everybody else knew what supply chain was or what disasters could happen, Tesla was very famously in production hell. So lots of different things happened, but basically to kind of like contextualize everything that was going on, Tesla was trying to create a brand new product at super high volume with no ramp up time, with unproven technology, with unproven manufacturing processes, with a new design. Like, we were doing it all, everything, 100%. Now, a lot of people think that vehicles have been made forever, and so an electric vehicle will be very similar to a regular engine vehicle, and that is not the case. There's just so many differences, and perhaps some of the similarities might be seats or steering wheels, but that might be where it ends. It's like there's just not a lot of components that transfer over, and I know many colleagues who would say even the seats and the steering wheels in a Tesla are like no other car on the planet. So yes, so that was the situation. Is we tried to do everything, and I think one of the things that I was involved in personally is that Elon said we automated too much too quickly, and one of the things he said is humans are overrated, which is like a very Elon thing to say, and that's where I spent a lot of my time. Is we bought tons of automation that took a while to get right, and anyone who's worked with equipment or automation knows it takes a while to get right, and we just didn't plan for it. And so there was all this time of me like actually trying to help the engineers fix that equipment and get parts for equipment and things like that. And it's not necessarily, Tesla did the best they could, and obviously they came out the better for it in the end. But just 100 new things all at the same time with no ramp up. And yeah, it was a nightmare. Yeah.
Hey, Nathan, I have a question for you. So, you talked about trying to do all these amazing things, also very challenging things, right? And in a similar way, but with soap, I was in the same place, right? We were pushing the bounds, right? And that's where innovation comes from. How much did you utilize the Tesla name in the conversations with vendors as you were trying to tackle on all of these seemingly crazy things?
Well, so we dropped the Tesla name constantly, but it wasn't as valuable back then as it is now. So like 2017, Tesla was a very small volume manufacturer that didn't make any money. And so we said, hey, like, we're going to be this really big thing. And they were like, but you're not. And so like the Tesla, like people who understood Tesla or appreciated what we were doing, like I would say probably half of the suppliers got it. And they're like, oh yeah, for sure. We're here for you. We'll drop everything. We'll make sure that you're taken care of. But there were a ton of suppliers that were like, yeah, we're not going to stick our necks out for you because you're not proven yet, and rightfully so at times, right? It's like, we hadn't proved ourselves. Like we hadn't made any money, It's like we'd burned billions of dollars of cash. It's like, that's not the type of like stellar company you want to be a supplier for, right? So, but people
I would argue, Amazon was unprofitable for many, many years. So, I feel like that was kind of the thing. The market has changed a lot this year. But when we look back over the course of the last 5 or 10 years, I feel like that was pretty common.
Yeah, very similar.
So, John, I asked you to come on the show because you have a very unique perspective in that you're very specialized in freight and logistics, which has had absolute craziness in the last 3 years. So I'd like to have you start by sharing what you feel was the biggest COVID train wreck that you experienced that was something that you never thought imaginable, like just absolute, can't even believe it. It was just insane. And then how did you solve and work around that? Because one of the things that makes you so unique is I feel like you're very, very creative and innovative, and you just kind of figure stuff out.
I think one of the biggest challenges that came about from COVID was the misunderstanding of your supplier's raw material, because a lot of times you're not brought on board to have visibility to their raw material. So you gave a PO, they would have a projected lead time. At the time that was getting fed into like an SAP system and says, okay, your time of delivery is here. It gets put in there, and then all these sales orders could get put on. And then all of a sudden you go from something that was a 30-week lead time to 90, especially now. Like if you look at electronics with microchips, like we have 90-week lead time, and all of a sudden everyone's panicking because it's like, well, we have everything else but this component. And then all of a sudden, you see all of a sudden, like the biggest mystery to me was the microchips themselves. You had companies that were buying them, and then all of a sudden they're going on the spot market for 5-6 times that. So chips that were $2-3 are $150. So when you have price points and say, like, for instance, with currently now with, like, say, a radio style, your margins are not that large. But when you're talking about the companies that were buying these, like in the medical field, they had the pocketbook to buy and hold this stuff and then consume what they wanted and then sell the balance on the open market. What I think a lot of people didn't predict was how much of that inventory would shrink up, that it would now push out your deliveries. And that's where, you kind of have to get creative. It's like, okay, do we have an alternate approved chip? Do we have a way around this? Can we reconfigure existing electronics to not need that chip, or use chips that we already have that we have readily available, or ones that you could get and reuse? So it was being able to, what I call a pivot or an audible, if you were looking at it from a sports analogy, is what can we do to keep the customers happy and keep the bottom line, keep the company profitable without having to completely reinvent the process mapping with the contract manufacturer, because we had no visibility or insights into that. The secondary part, which I think most people didn't anticipate, was the backlog at the ports. LA, Long Beach, for instance, everything I've done for many, many years has been LA, Long Beach. I was out there in, 2019, you're coming over and there's 60, 70 ships out there, which was unprecedented. So then, you start going where you had an ocean time of say 45 or 50 days, now became 70, 80. And where that comes in a problem with the company is you're paying your vendor in a 60, 40, 30, 60-day terms. So you're paying for inventory you can't even sell and that you don't even have in your building. So it complicated, especially companies that are owned by private equity or ones that borrow based on receivables and inventory valuation. You were paying for inventory you couldn't even get into your building to sell or even kit up to be sold with other things. And I know that was one of the biggest headaches I faced when I first came to AMP was they were averaging about 71 days from the manufacturer in China to delivery in our Ontario, California location. I averaged, when I was able to get everything figured out and, dialed in because I have a lot of those understandings, we averaged all of Q4 at 35 days. From end to end, from China, from our manufacturer in China to delivery in my warehouse was about 35 days. When I started, they were paying, say, $16,000, $20,000 a container. To currently, my all-in might be $2,000 or $3,000. So having that understanding and knowing where you can, jump in for your company to help predict or help contribute. And I think the biggest issue that most companies face is lack of collaboration between departments. I've worked at the very big companies where procurement was on the West Coast, but operations was on the East Coast. And in the middle, so you had procurement that might have been buying stuff that logistics had no idea of. And then all of a sudden it's ready and it's like, whoa, that customer predicted 300 units a week and now they want 600 units. Well, you didn't buy enough in that time frame. So now I got to do a combination of air freight to bring it in to make sure we can make that number, ship the balance ocean, but keep the profit margin where it needs to be and to keep all the parties happy. And I think in a post-COVID situation, supply chain operations and procurement people really came to the forefront because at those times, that's when companies really saw what could be done with people that had the experience in that area. Where in pre-COVID, you kind of were never given a seat at the table. Now, all of a sudden, you're the first person they're running to help, fix the day. And now they have to rely on that experience because everything else, all the fancy ERPs aren't going to do anything if you can't get it on a boat, get it on a plane and move it and get it into your warehouse. That ERP telling you a 90-week lead time, well, that's what it's told. So it's just, hey, everything's perfectly fine. But you're trying to say that to your big box store company, customer that says, hey, you told me we'd have these in 30 or 45 days. We need these on the shelf, so we're going to go to a competitor. So it's, okay, how can you jump through those hoops? And I think having that collaboration where procurement, ops, logistics, warehouse, distribution are all on the same wavelength and understanding every movement. Because one thing I do, procurement does, rolls into, with me with, okay, now it's ready, it needs to ship. I need to get it into the warehouse so they can get enough time to get it to a customer. And having everybody on that same page is kind of what is the most crucial thing now, especially where, margins are tighter, certain things are starting to, peak up when customers are really wanting more of stuff. And you're still having chip problems, the chip shortages are still prevalent.
So what really stands out to me, and I'll see if Rachel or Stephen have a train wreck example, but that 90 week lead time, right? Something used to be maybe a couple weeks, a month, and you're extending things out a year, 2 years, 3 years. I mean, that's just like major train wreck. So Stephen and Rachel, do you guys have a lead time train wreck that you've lived through recently?
Yeah. And I think, COVID really was like the start of a lot of this kind of nonsense of where you said, okay, yeah, we've been working on this project now for 6 months. We have a timeline in place. We're going to make this launch. And then all of a sudden your lead time doubles, triples, right? I have a recent example where glass, right? So glass over the last year has been exceptionally turbulent. And I'm talking very much in the cosmetic space, but we had a lot of glass coming from Europe, right? Which that was great during COVID because we weren't having the issues with China or with India and some of that freight issue that was being seen. But then when the energy crisis hit in Europe because of the Ukraine conflict, we were then seeing, factories having to shut down because they were being told by the government, you're not getting any more energy, right? Or it was just too expensive to be running their operations. So either you were paying through the nose to try to get them to run your product, or you were just faced with the backlog and the shutdown from all of the issues in Europe. So yeah, glass for me over the past year became a huge hot button topic, and we went from 4-month lead times, right, which was long but manageable, up to 52-week lead times, right? So that was definitely one of the issues. And I think one of the things that I've been really pushing, and I had a boss one time used to say, never let a crisis go to waste, right? So we should always be looking to improve. And, John, kind of to what you were talking about is, I've really tried to use the opportunities where we've had supply issues to try to re-emphasize what does best practice look like to avoid these issues. Because if anyone has learned anything over the last couple of years, is that it's just one thing after another, right? So how much resiliency can you build in advance, right? It's much, much easier to qualify a secondary source when you're in the development process than when you have nothing on hand and are struggling to do it, right? So I think really what I've been trying to focus the teams on is that we're not going to be able to solve every problem. We're not going to be able to forecast every problem. But what we need to be doing is taking control of what we can. And we actually have much more power to influence much earlier on in the projects to try to make our lives better. And so I think for me, making sure that procurement and supply chain have that seat, like in the innovation, like the very initial ideation sessions, is super, super critical. Because by the time you're already locking in specifications, it's too late, right? So for me, John, just hearing you talking about like, oh yeah, like, do we have a secondary qualified source? Can we use this in another place? That's all stuff that we have control over. And I don't think, or often supply chain doesn't have that right voice at the table to express those things early
and
on.
many times you may have a system that doesn't talk to each other. So for instance,
Right.
You may have a procurement software that exists outside of your ERP, but your logistics and your ops people have no visibility to it. So if you've made a change in there, it doesn't show in the other system until all of a sudden, it runs a weekly or monthly report. And then all of a sudden you see everything's gone haywire and you don't know where it came from.
Yeah. So funny story. I remember I was trying to buy something. We had quotes for, we knew what the lead time was for all these parts that we quoted. And when we went back to requote, the lead time went from 14 days or 12 weeks. I can't remember exactly, to over a year. And we called the supplier and we were like, what on earth is like happening? And so here's the deal: is Apple specs in very specific things, and this isn't for Apple Apple products. This is for Apple equipment that makes Apple products, right? So it's like pretty far deep into the supply chain, into the manufacturing. And so like when Apple launches a new iPhone, all the capacity gets bought up for these subcomponents. And literally nobody on the planet can get them in less than a year. It's like, yeah, we're going to be tied up for the next year helping Apple. Sorry. And I'm just like, and I was there, like, Apple's released a new phone every single year for the last 10 years. It's like, wouldn't you think that you knew how to handle this capacity issue yet? It's like, figure this out. Come on. Like, you have other customers, but they didn't care. It's like, no, we got a contract with them. We're good. I don't know. It was insane. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, so I definitely kind of going off what Rachel said. I think there's a lot of the best way to avoid some of these issues, or at least mitigate them, is definitely early on in the development phase, and you should always have a minimum. I always say, if you can, you should have a minimum of 3 approved sources for everything. And obviously that's not always feasible, but in a perfect world, that's really what you should be doing. And if you can't do that, that's the type of stuff where you need to go have a chat with purchasing or someone in materials and say, hey, look, this This one, but there's no alternative. There is no, it's a full redesign of the entire product if we can't get this part, and manage it right up front with an aggressive and big purchase is usually, one way to kind of cheat around it. But that's, if you're not used to that sort of huge, fluctuation in lead times, or, other companies buying up huge chunks of stock, you can get caught off guard and can't get any material. But also relationships with distribution, they can have, put stock on, kind of set aside for certain customers. If you have agreements in place, there's also things like that as well.
And I've got to throw in, being that I'm Miss Supply Chain Supplier Collaboration. Collabing with your suppliers in real time is very important. So if your supplier is not going to be able to deliver or fulfill the order, if there's something, so you have the time to pivot and be proactive versus something just not arriving and, oh crap, now I'm in scramble firefighting mode.
Sarah, do you know any companies that do supplier collaboration?
Hey now. We'll stay on track for our convo today. Something that Rachel brought up that I want to ask you, Stephen, and then ask Rachel. Rachel mentioned about the collaboration in regards to with the engineering and innovation and building of product. Stephen, can you share maybe a train wreck example, because you do a lot of new product introductions, around how component design and selection impact the supply chain and have maybe caused a disaster or two for you in your career?
Yeah, I can definitely think of a good example. We were onboarding for this new customer, particularly large product. The BOM was, or at the time it was like 600, 700 components. Basically we're informed that the ECO to formally release the BOM into our system was being sent over to us. So we're kind of, taking receipt of that ECO. We knew what it was. So, everyone kind of pushed it through. And after the fact, we realized that the BOM had grown by about 300 parts plus. And we were kind of scratching our heads going, how's that? That's got to be a mistake. Something must have happened. That can't be right. That's not what we talked about. Come to find out, the engineering team decided that they would make an addition to the BOM. It ended up being like an additive piece to the existing product. But they had decided to handle all of the material purchases for those parts through their NPI process. And so they decided the materials teams didn't need to know about this change. Wasn't relevant because they had already bought the parts. So they also did not keep track of any of the materials that they purchased, and then they just kind of sent them to us. So not only were we kind of caught in a situation where, I'm essentially double driving demand, but I also don't really know, where I'm supposed to phase in, which parts were you able to, secure supply for, which ones weren't you able to do, where am I taking over in the supply chain? And I think that had a lot of pretty significant ramifications right off the bat, because basically I had my ERP MRP feed was not very useful, especially when you think about the material that I'm already receiving from the customers. This is in addition to all the stuff that we had already been taking. So we would wind up going through. I've gone through hundreds of RDLs, receiving discrepancy log resolutions, just trying to get things cleared up. And then if you can imagine, you've got, I've got POs up for this material, and we're also receiving it from our customer. How, someone in receiving could accidentally receive stuff on the wrong PO. That definitely happened. So it can have, if things aren't set up right and there isn't strong communication right up front between engineering and materials teams, that's a big problem. You've really got to make sure that both teams are on the same page when it comes to what needs to be communicated and what doesn't. So I think that was probably that was definitely one of the biggest train wrecks I ran into.
Rachel, what about you? What about a train wreck time when procurement was brought in too late on a new project?
Yeah. So during my time making soap, right, we did a lot of limited edition programs, right, and seasonal programs. So holiday was always a big one. Holiday hand wash. If people don't buy hand wash specifically for Christmas, you're missing out. But holiday hand wash was always a big thing. And these were always really considered just rip and reapply, right? It was the same vendors, right? So procurement wasn't heavily involved. It was typically a very light touch. However, in this particular example, the design team had come up with this really beautiful design, very, very technically challenging though. And I think, procurement, we weren't really heavily involved because it was, it's the same vendor that we use, same bottle, same pumps, all this jazz. And really, we needed to be brought in much earlier to work on the negotiation with the vendor who we had always been using because it was so technically difficult. The pricing came back, same typical number of colors that we were using, but so much more technically challenging that the pricing came back astronomical, let alone we were having issues actually achieving the design at the end, right? So we had to send people on press check time and time again to get this right. It's limited edition. So, you have one time really, to get the volume in that you need, and then you're going and begging for topping up on this one particular SKU versus another. And so I think this was a great learning for me, was that just because it's a rip and reapply, there's no such thing as rip and reapply. And we really needed to have procurement there to elevate these potential risks in a much different way, even though they were vendors that we had always been working with time and time again. So again, a different design can have a massive impact to your vendor base, and anything that's either a limited edition or anything that is a seasonal product also comes with its own significant supply challenges.
So John, same to you. A lot of times freight and logistics is forgotten about. You guys are the ugly stepchild. We have a product. We're ready to ship. Oh, shoot. We actually
John's not ugly.
We need to actually
He is
be able to get this to our customer. So what is your biggest train wreck, or one of the train wrecks you've experienced where you're brought in too late, and what happened?
I want to say it was a train wreck because of the ask, not because maybe brought too late. I had a situation with a company, one of the big lighting company, that we had to move a entire 60,000 square foot warehouse during China Golden Week. So it had to move from Louisville, Kentucky, which was an external UPS supply chain, to our internal in El Paso, Texas. And we had to be up and running the Monday after Golden Week with no headaches. So it was me and another person going down to Louisville, Kentucky. It was 31 full truckloads out the door within a 4-day period. And then it was flying to El Paso, make sure they were received in. Everything was good. Testing within the SAP, because at the same time they were implementing SAP. So it was a two double whammy, because these had always been in an external warehouse and now they're in an internal warehouse. They wanted to control the cost, but it was moving, 31 truckloads of material in a week period, and being up and running that Monday with zero hiccups, and pulled it off. It was not easy. It was a lot of no sleep, because you're going into a place that you don't control it. It's not your warehouse. So we had to pay to actually have extra people there running 24/7 to be able to pull these things off the rack, because you're in a third-party warehouse. Not everything is wrapped. You have a bunch of half pallets, so the utilization in the trucks had to be at the maximum. So it was creating wrapping and then creating the UPC codes so they could be scannable, so that it was easy to receive at our warehouse. So it was a gigantic feat to be able to pull off. And then we've had special ones with special projects where, we had similar location that it had to be somewhere in Christmas. So I ended up renting a car and driving from Louisville, Kentucky up to New York City to deliver something on Christmas Eve, because it had to be there. And the contractor was actually out on holiday, surprise, surprise. But no one would deliver. So I literally was getting a rental vehicle, putting 4 pallets of very high-end lights into the vehicle and driving it to New York City on Christmas Eve, and then driving from New York City back to Boston at the time. So those craziness happen. To me, when I had interns that worked for me, one of the things I always used to love to say is, do you want to read about a case study or do you want to live through one? Because everything you read and going through supply chain in school now, it's all these, widget A moved. It's not like, okay, you're getting the call with your hair on fire because this is already going on and here, fix it. And that's usually what we end up getting. And so it's having enough experience to understand that, logistics is always organized chaos. It is never going to be smooth. It is never going to be a fine process. My job is to make that roller coaster ride less. And we're going to have bumps, we're going to have highs, we're going to have lows, but mine's to try to smooth out that process versus trying to go on this thing that shoots up at 100 feet, at 200 miles an hour, then drops back down. Because that costs the company money every time you have those highs and lows. Is being able to have what I call that bullpen for that decision. Hey, do we need this? Okay, well, we'll split up 4 pallets, we'll air freight, and we'll put the rest on ocean. We'll minimize the cost, the aggregate combined total landed cost is less, but we're able to keep all the back orders flowing and moving stored. So, keeping those things happening is, I don't want to say never happens, because for me, it's a regular occurrence. You probably get, even now it's like, hey, these containers are due in June 1st and 2nd. Can we get them in at the end of the month? And it's like, they're not going to speed up a boat for me, but my job is, okay, can I get it in? When is it arriving at the port? Can we get everything, like I pre-clear them through customs so that it's less, I can control all the little, what I call time sappers that exist in transportation. What is in my control, what is not? And then anything within my control, I minimize as much as possible. And that's kind of where now, like, I think one of the best times we had was 31 days from ports in China to delivery through Long Beach. So for 31 days, that's, pretty good. And be able to average that, that speed to market comes in as, a significant savings to the company. We're able to get stuff in and sell it before you're making that payment to the vendor. Because we also, on the flip side, and I'm sure many of you are encountering this, you may have vendors now that want a prepayment because they're carrying certain costs. So now you give them a PO and now they want 10, 20% down because they're outlaying a bunch of costs to bring this material in to build to your time frame that's, may not be within the scope that they want to deal with.
So I encourage you to reach out to Nathan, Stefan, John, and Rachel on LinkedIn. They're all doing really amazing work in the manufacturing and supply chain space. Follow their content, reach out, shoot them a note. And with that, I'm wishing everyone a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you. Have a fun,
Thanks,
everybody.
Sarah.
Thanks for tuning in today. If you missed anything, you can check out the show notes. You can find us by typing in What the Duck, another supply chain podcast in Google. To have optimal search results, make sure to add another supply chain podcast. This brings us to the end of another episode of What the Duck, another supply chain podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Scudder, and we'll be back next week.